Hello again, watch friends. Welcome back. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about this particular watch. It's the Jaeger-LeCoultre 25th anniversary master control date. Now, this watch was introduced earlier this year in January at the SIHH show. If you don't know, SIHH stands for Salon International de la Haute Horologie. So basically, it's a trade fair for the watch industry. Now, the reason it's called the 25th anniversary watch is that it's been 25 years since JLC, Jaeger-LeCoultre, had introduced their Master Control Collection. That was 1992, of course. And in January at SIHH, they introduced a trio of watches. There was the World Time, Second Time Zone watch called the Master Geographic. There was the chronograph called the Master Chronograph. And then there's this watch, which is a three-hander with a date, called the Master Control Date. This is reference number 1548530. So the Master Control Date, this is also called sometimes the sector dial. You can see that there's two sections on the dial. There's a gray section, there's a white section in the middle. I'll talk more about those in a second. But it's the current version of their Master Control series. So it's obviously a two-tone sector dial, white and silver. It does have blue accents, which I hope you can see. If you look carefully here, you can see on every 5-second on the minute ring is a blue highlight, 5, 10, 15, etc. You can see that the date itself is blue numbers on a white background in a framed window. And this may be a little bit more difficult to see, but all three hands, the hour hand, minute hand, and second hand, are all blued. Sometimes a little difficult to see in the video, but in the bright sunlight, they really sparkle, really quite nice. Of course, it's got skeleton hands. That's one of the trademarks of this particular watch. Both the minute and hour hand are skeletonized. It beats at 28,800 beats per hour. It's an in-house automatic movement. It's JLC's 899/1. It's quite ubiquitous from JLC, and this is really considered one of their entry-level watches. Now, the previous version of the Master Control, which you'll see a picture of above, which has solid hands with a little bit of loom, that list price is about $6,350. This watch, the sector dial watch, is about 10% less. It lists for $5,700. 38-hour power reserve and a 50-meter water resistance, about 150 feet, more or less. Of course, it's got the date at 3 o'clock. I mentioned that. And it's a 39-millimeter dial. It's a very thin, 8.5 millimeters thick. A little trouble focusing here. You can see that it is quite thin. It wears very nicely. Notice how flat it is on the bottom. And of course, the back has an open case back or exhibition case back where you can see a gold JLC rotor and a little better picture, a little better view of the movement. Blue screws. Just very beautiful. One thing I like about the dial is that it really is quite spacious. It doesn't look crowded. It proportionately seems just right. Notice the minute hand reaches to the outer minute track. The hour hand just touches the inner line of the gray section of the dial, and it's got sort of it's got design cues of the past JLC watches, and others for that matter. If you look closely, you might see a little bit of Patek Philippe. Patek has a sector dial that's been, don't know if it's in current production, but it's been around, of course, even more expensive. And of course, Omega and IWC have had sector dial watches. So the bottom line is that it looks both vintage and modern. I think part of the modern aspect is the highlights, the blue highlights, the font of the numbers, and the fact that it really is elegant. If you look closely at from a distance, it looks like, oh, there's a white center and a gray surround on this watch. But when you look closely, let's see if we can do that here, the inner part, the inner white section, is sort of a frosted, I wouldn't call it white, I wouldn't call it cream. It's almost a sunbursty, frosted kind of, almost, it's not textured, but it looks textured. Quite interesting. And of course the matte silver surround, really, I think the juxtaposition of the two, the matte silver surround and the white center, give it sort of a depth that it would otherwise not have. And that also adds to the simple yet elegant aesthetic of this watch. And you can see that the lugs aren't particularly long. It's got that flat case back, as I mentioned before. Comes on a leather croc dial with a JLC signed buckle. And you can see there's a signed crown, if I can get that just right there. There we go. So I've already mentioned that it has a solid rose gold rotor on the back, which is really, really quite nice. It's both automatic and manual wind. Of course, it has hacking, which means the second hand stops when you pull the crown out to the outer position to set the time, so you can calibrate it. And of course, it does have that exhibition case back. I want to talk about the movement for a second, or actually the series itself. So the reason that this series is called Master Control is because when this watch first came out in 1992, or the series of watches first came out in 1992, they went through 1,000 hours of testing, what they call 1,000 hours control testing. So that's where the Master Control lingo comes from. And what's interesting is they do the testing of the entire finished watch. So this testing is really much more stringent than COSC certification or some other certifications, where I know COSC, for example, only tests the movement itself, the movement which is outside the watch. They test movements in bulk, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think they may even do some sampling. In other words, they might get 100 movements from a brand, and they might test 25 of them at random or as a sample, and if those 25 are good, then that's statistically significant, and they can say the rest of the 100 are meet the specification. Unlike that, JLC tests the entire watch with the movement inside. It's a 6-week program of tests. They test the watch in 6 positions. They test it for such things as impact, temperature, water resistance, and a few more things. So it's really, really quite an extensive test, hence the name Master Control or 1,000-hour testing. And that's really one of the things you're paying for in a JLC watch. So in summary, what do I like about the JLC Master Control date? Well, it's real watchmaking. They make their own movements, and they provide their movements to others. For example, they provide their movements to Vacheron Constantin and a few other brands. So JLC is a real watchmaking company, and has been for quite a long time. It's a relatively affordable price, especially for this level of quality, and this is really high horology. This is just really special. It's a limited run. Unofficially, I've learned that they plan to make about 4,000 watches for the entire trio of watches. In other words, the World Timer, the chronograph, and this freehand date watch. There'll be 4,000 watches made over the course of the next year. So I didn't buy it because it's potentially limited. I bought it because of the quality, and it's beautiful, and it really fits in with what I like about watches in my watch collection. And finally, the simplicity and elegance. With this watch on the wrist, it provides just the right amount of presence. It's not gaudy or flashy, but it is elegant and beautiful. So with that, let me put it on the wrist right now. Give me a moment. And it's going on the wrist. And there it is on my, I move the glove down, on my 7.5-inch wrist. So there's only a couple of things I potentially dislike about this watch. One is, let me push the strap in. One is the strap itself. Notice that I'm in the very last position of the strap. I generally like a little more tail on my straps. Not really a problem. It's extremely comfortable, very lightweight. As you can see, it looks just right. So that's one potential downside. And then the other one is, I wonder, and I think I've already answered this since I've had this watch for the last 2 days, or day and a half, is would I get tired of this sector dial? Because I was considering the other version, the more classic silvered version of the watch, previous version. But I think I'm glad I made this choice, and I do like it. So that's the Jaeger-LeCoultre 25th anniversary master control date sector dial watch. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. I recently did a video on collecting vintage watches, and in that video I mentioned something about buying watches that fit into your collection goals. In other words, it's fine to be interested in different kinds of watches, whether they be divers or railroad watches or dress watches or chronographs or other kinds of categories, specific brand only watches, but you really can't get every watch that you like. That's pretty obvious to most collectors. So you really have to keep in mind what your goals are, both short-term and long-term, and what is really going to make you happy. So in the case of this JLC Master Control, I knew that, I guess almost for a year, that I would like to have this watch, or actually the predecessor, the Silver Dial Master Control. And in the past month or so, I was almost seduced by a couple other watches. For example, I saw a vintage Seiko Lord Marvel that was beautiful, and I've always wanted a high beat Seiko vintage watch, so I almost bought that. There was a mass drop of Young Hands in the last few weeks, and some of those watches appealed to me, and there were some other temptations as well. But the point is that had I bought, let's say, both the Seiko Lord Marvel and the mass drop, the Young Hands, that would have been more than 20% of the cost of this watch. And sure, I would have had two more watches, but I would have not reached my goal of getting the Jaeger, and I may not have been as happy long term as I think I will be now. So you really have to keep in mind your watch goals. It's better to have fewer watches that are higher quality than a whole bunch of watches of low to medium quality. Not to say that the Young Hands or the Seiko are low quality, but they're nowhere near the high horology category that this Jaeger watch is part of. So just wanted to mention that, something that you need to keep in mind constantly, because as a watch collector, or actually any kind of collector, any kind of hobby that you're into, there are a lot of temptations that you need to think about when you're trying to reach your long-term goals. So I've worn the Jaeger Master Control constantly for the last 36 hours, and I am now putting it on my time grapher for the first time. I was very curious to see what kinds of specs this would have, and as you can see, first of all, you can see that it's either spot on or minus 1 second per day in terms of accuracy. It does take a few minutes for the time grapher to settle down, or for the watch to settle down. Secondly, you see it's got a very strong amplitude, 319 degrees, as you would expect. The beat error is 0.1 millisecond, which means that it's the rotation of the hairspring is equal in both directions, which is good. And finally, as I mentioned in my review, that it's 28,800 beats per hour. Notice that the lines here are almost on top of each other. So I imagine in wearing this and having it in different positions, it would either maintain this accuracy or get even better. So this isn't quite out of the box, because it came out of the box yesterday about noon, and now it's about, well, according to the watch, it's about 5 after 6 in the evening. So it's, like I said, about 36 hours or so of constantly wearing the watch. Anyway, just wanted to share my first time grapher analysis of the Jaeger-LeCoultre master control date sector dial. Thank you.